Good morning, everyone. My name is Barbara Volotskova. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, and I'll be serving as a moderator for today's Counterpoint Southeast Asia webinar. For those of you joining us for the first time, Counterpoint Southeast Asia is a webinar and policy brief series that addresses questions on strategic significance to Southeast Asia by putting together diverse perspectives from invited experts from the region. Each issue of Counterpoint tackles a crucial topic, and today specifically, we are addressing the question of how ASEAN can ensure food security amidst increasing global supply chain disruptions. Following the definition of the United Nations, food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. As you know, the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic and the 2022 Russia-Ukraine war have exposed ASEAN's vulnerability to global supply chain disruptions, raising critical concerns about food security. The region's dependence on food imports, particularly wheat, soybeans, and maize, further exacerbates food security concerns. Recognizing these vulnerabilities, ASEAN has implemented several measures, such as the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, adopted in 2020, which includes strategies to strengthen food security and enhance supply chain resilience. The bloc has also expanded the ASEAN +3 emergency rice reserve to secure rice availability during crises. However, despite these initiatives, the region continues to face substantial food security risks. Recent events such as the escalating US-China trade war and Donald Trump's proposed tariffs could pose additional challenges to the region's food security. Moreover, the intensifying impact of climate change and increasing frequency of natural disasters further complicate ASEAN efforts. Given this context, we are here today to discuss a key fundamental question: how can ASEAN ensure food security amidst increasing global supply chain disruptions? In other words, what innovative and sustainable solutions should ASEAN put in place to enhance its food security? And to help us address these questions today, we have invited four speakers, four experts from across the region. And before I introduce them, I would like to remind each of them that they have 8 to 10 minutes to present their key arguments. And after each speaker is done with the presentation, we'll open the floor to questions and discussion. For those of you in the audience, please feel free to submit your questions or comments in the Q&A box below. And after the presentations, I'll read and ask the questions one by one. So with this point in mind, I'll proceed to briefly introduce the speakers in order in which they will present. These are brief introductions for their full impressive profiles, so you can refer to their biographies at the CHE website. To begin with, we have Ms. Elisa Carroll-Luther, who is a food security expert and urban planner. She is currently a visiting fellow at ICS, Yusof Ishak Institute, and concurrently an advisor at Morrow Intelligence, a data-driven foresight urban solutions company. We also have Ms. Genevieve Donelon-May, who is a geopolitical and global strategy advisor interested in regional resource governance and environmental conflict in Asia. Currently, she is the Asia-Pacific analyst at the Red Line and a researcher at the Oxford Global Society and a fellow at the Indo-Pacific Studies Center. Then we have Ms. Mei Cho, who is a research assistant at the Center on Asia and Globalization here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. May's research interests include US-China rivalry, security strategies, and geopolitics in Asia-Pacific. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jose Malui Montes Claros, who is a full-time research fellow with the Center of Non-Traditional Security Studies at RSIS, where he teaches the political economy of development and conducts policy analysis with dynamic models of food security and climate change. So we have a great lineup with us today, and let's start with Elisa, who in her essay for this Counterpoint Southeast Asia emphasizes that ASEAN has already developed robust policy frameworks, but now faces urgency in translating these policies into tangible actions. I give the floor to you, Elisa.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Good morning, everybody. And a warm welcome also to my fellow panelists and the audience here today. I'm honored to be invited to share my views. As Barbara has mentioned, my focus is on ASEAN as a body, that it needs to shift gears into a higher gear to action to promote the region's food security. Let me first start by highlighting that ASEAN has had substantial strides in the last 10 years and even the last 20, 30 years to improve food security, and most recently under the ASEAN Vision and Strategic Plan on Food, Agriculture and Forestry, 2016 to 2025 plan. So some of the major outputs that it has had since then is, for example, the guidelines on promoting responsible investment, finished in 2018, the ASEAN guidelines on promoting the utilization of digital technologies for the food and agriculture sector, the implementation of international standards for SPS measures, sustainable harvest and resource management, agriculture insurance implementation, the regional guidelines and action plan on sustainable agriculture, and even guidelines on home and backyard gardens. Adjacent to this, they've also completed other studies not directly linked to food, including for one that is very important to me, the ASEAN State of Climate Change Report, the study of nature-based solutions across forests, barrenlands, and coastal ecosystems, and also the ASEAN Guide on AI governance and ethics. So you can see they've been busy. They've been doing quite a lot. However, ASEAN has covered a number of things, but these have not necessarily translated into action in the various ministries. If all ASEAN member states were to adopt the guidelines and the frameworks that ASEAN has introduced, then we would actually be in a very good state, agriculturally speaking. So this is unfortunately not the case, and ASEAN is still vulnerable when it comes to food security, and we are increasingly becoming more and more vulnerable. In the ICIS Youth of Asia, Southeast Asia Outlook Survey, Climate Outlook Survey, which we have had for the last 5 years, we've asked the question how each person's perception of food insecurity is growing. And the survey found that 7 in 10 have indicated that they experienced some form of food insecurity in 2024. This could be frequently, sometimes, or often. But this compared to 6 in 10 in 2023. So the numbers are growing, and I expect it to keep growing. ASEAN does not have the mandate or muscle to implement its guidelines. As a body, that's how it's configured. It has to work with member states. However, it can play to its strengths and action where it has an edge. So in my essay, I am suggesting 4 areas that I believe ASEAN can do this. The first one is that ASEAN can consider it promoting more trade, and it now needs to focus more on intra-ASEAN agri-food trade. ASEAN has already removed 98% of intra-ASEAN trade barriers, but some still remain. Whenever food product supplies are squeezed, member states still resort to export bans. This has affected rice, palm oil, chicken, and other products in the recent past. Currently, intra-ASEAN trade is stagnant and has been for a while at under 30%. In comparison, intra-EU trade is about 70%. So we have a long way to go to increase it to that amount. This requires facilitating multilateral trade agreements with provisions against non-tariff barriers, measures, and also to stop unilateral export bans that can further destabilize the sector. This also requires greater harmonization of quality standards and certification and accreditation to improve flow. Chief among them, and the priorities are for halal, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, pesticides, minimum residue levels, and others. It also requires more widespread adoption among Southeast Asia's 100 million farmers on good agricultural practices, good animal husbandry practices, and good aquacultural practices. So that's the first, to improve trade. The second one is that it should promote cross-sector enablers for market inclusion and resilience. The two enablers I feel that are of priority are R&D for promotion of effective climate smart agricultural solutions, and secondly, on digitalization in the agri-food sector. The sheer variety of climate smart solutions is often overwhelming, especially for a farmer with small capital. It results actually in a paradox of choice or choice overload. So then people prefer then to follow the status quo rather than making any selections. ASEAN has the role and has the ability to direct funding of R&D towards simplifying these choices and identifying those that are effective. In regards to digitalization, ASEAN has shared its guidelines on the promotion of utilization of digital technologies for ASEAN food and agricultural sector. However, and this is quite extensive. However, I wanted to add one more, and that is to include generative AI and large language models, LLMs, contextualized to Southeast Asia. This then opens up queryable information for farmers, and in fact, anybody who wants to use it, where language is no longer a barrier and solution specific to identify solutions specific to this region. Think about it as ChatGPT in Tagalog or Khmer, or even any of the more native languages, with farmers being able to ask what the market conditions are for a particular fruit or vegetable. So that's the kind of empowerment they can receive if they have access to this. There's currently at least one initiative to develop a Southeast Asia-specific LLM, and that is the Southeast Asian Language in One Network, CLAN for short. More would be useful, as more then would be able to train a greater range of LLMs and generative AI tools and to answer to our relevant needs. But of course, more work also needs to be done by ASEAN and the various states to ensure robust safeguards. Thirdly, ASEAN needs to promote stockpiling diversification. It currently lacks strategies beyond rice security. In times of stress, the region will require a diversity of food products beyond rice, whether it is to eggs or salt or sugar for the health and well-being of the population. Maybe not the sugar and salt for the health and well-being. ASEAN also needs to work on simplifying the protocols for the release of emergency food reserves because it's currently very unclear. Last but not least, ASEAN should also spearhead the safeguarding of the region's commons, whether it's terrestrial or marine forests, mangroves, and coral reefs, so crucial for Southeast Asia's mitigation and adaptation needs, and protecting its rich biodiversity. One way this can be done is for ASEAN to promote a common identity or pride in our natural resources to create an ASEAN-level ownership, which currently doesn't exist. One example that it could start with is the promotion of the Coral Triangle as an ASEAN treasure. The Coral Triangle is known as the Amazon of the sea because of its sheer richness in biodiversity. 75% of the world's coral species can be found in the Coral Triangle. It mainly sits between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines, but it also crosses over to some Pacific Island nations as well. But it is crucial for Southeast Asia's fisheries, and it's currently undergoing some stress. This way, there may be a common responsibility to protect it, and with greater awareness globally about it, they may get the same attention and even funding as other important coral ecosystems, such as the Great Barrier Reef. A common narrative could also be carved out about Southeast Asia's equatorial and subtropical forests. It's important otherwise, as these irreplaceable commons may disappear under the pressures of conversion for arable land and other imperatives. Moving forward, implementation of these strategies requires substantial resources, and ASEAN should explore funding mechanisms beyond member state contributions, including partnerships with dialogue and development partners as well as private sectors. A draw card could be bilateral or multilateral agreements for preferred partnerships in times of food shortages, similar to the Green Lane arrangements during COVID times. Unfortunately, time is not luxury for Southeast Asia, and collective effort, especially by ASEAN, is needed to stave off the growing challenges to food security. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Elisa, for your insights. You have established the urgency of the situation and identified important priority areas ASEAN should focus on. So complementing the perspective you offered, we are now moving to Genevieve, who in her essay focuses on specific economic consequences and vulnerabilities stemming from food security risks in Southeast Asia. Genevieve, you have the floor.
So again, thank you, Barbara, for the kind introduction. And as Elisa and Barbara have already touched on, we see that global food systems, whether they've been strained by COVID-19, other conflicts like Ukraine-Russia war, climate shocks, US protectionism, and of course the responses to US protectionism, as well as geopolitical tensions, means that both globally and regionally that we are all facing deepening vulnerabilities with food security in our food supply systems. Southeast Asia, of course, is particularly vulnerable due to its reliance on the US for key imports like soybeans and wheat, and also as a key export market. So for Southeast Asia, or for ASEAN, sorry, the US is a key export market for key commodities like palm oil, rice, and coffee. And so regional vulnerabilities compounded by ever increasing and more devastating climate change impacts, not to mention US and China trade tensions and what appears to be the beginning of the bifurcation of the global order with the China-led system on one side and US-led system on the other side. I think it's clear to say that the need for a comprehensive food security strategy has never been more urgent. So to add to Alyssa's helpful points earlier, some of the things that ASEAN has already done at a regional level to enhance food security is put forward the ASEAN Emergency Rice Reserves under the ASEAN Food Security Reserve, as well as the ASEAN Food Security Information System. So then what could ASEAN do next? I have outlined 4 suggestions in my essay, and I'll go through them point by point. So the first is that building up local production seems like the obvious answer, right? We could look to ASEAN's major food producers, whether that's Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which could, at least in theory, expand their output to enhance regional food security through greater trade. However, there are concerns, whether that's from climate change, resource limitations, particularly water, soil, land constraints, as well as, of course, smallholder inefficiencies, which all in turn could unfortunately hinder productivity. Then we can look to other Southeast Asian countries like Singapore, for instance, which of course imports around 90% of the food that it consumes, Brunei and Timor-Leste, which also rely heavily on food imports. So in their case, it's necessitating diversified supply chains, and innovations like vertical farming and urban farming would play a much greater role. So to some extent, I believe that emerging technologies, whether that's AI-driven irrigation, soil monitoring, biotechnologies, could help tackle a number of these concerns, whether that's water pollution, land degradation, as well as labor shortages, and to address yield gaps, as well as to also better predict, for instance, pest outbreaks to better support farmers. Then in addition to that, complementing the technological adoption, ASEAN as a whole, as well as the individual countries, could and should be prioritizing research and development, particularly into biotechnology. So that could be looking at, for instance, drought-resistant crops, as well as agri-technologies like precision farming, which could further help address all of these concerns. The second point is that ASEAN can, of course, build on the existing efforts like the ASEAN +3 Emergency Rice Reserve. So the first way that it could do so is to expand the reserves so that they also include other key staples like wheat, soybeans, maize, key staples as part of efforts to help mitigate the impact of global and regional market fluctuations, whether that's in supply or in prices, and also to provide regional reserves for key food imports for all food importing countries across Southeast Asia. Further to that, ASEAN could also work with regional partners like Australia and New Zealand. I use these countries as examples, one that I'm from Australia, so of course I'm very biased in this regard, but also that the two countries are agricultural powerhouses and they also produce significant quantities of both grains and oilseed, which is the so-called backbone of food security, which could in turn help support the ASEAN +3 regional reserves. And at the same time, strengthening regional trade ties could also help reduce reliance on more distant suppliers, such as various European countries, and also help avoid various supply chain disruptions in other parts of the world. For instance, I'm sure that we're all familiar with the Houthi disruptions in the Red Sea, as well as, of course, the Ukraine-Russia war. And in all cases that the reserves should be regularly monitored and reviewed so that they can be adjusted where necessary. The third point, as Alyssa has already mentioned, would be encouraging stronger intra-regional trade and broader efforts to support this. So that could take the form of, for instance, intra-ASEAN food corridors and increasing intra-regional trade just to help mitigate any risks from the geopolitical tensions that we are already seeing playing out both globally and regionally, as well as to help provide a buffer against any form of external shocks that we might see, whether that is a climate shock, a political shock, geoeconomic, economic, and so on. And by doing so, the aim is to create a much more stable and efficient food supply within the region. And to further support that, implementing early warning systems across ASEAN, whether that's for climate monitoring, for the tracking of food choke points, and also improving the oversight of global price volatility would further allow ASEAN member countries to respond more effectively, both as a collective and individually, to any sudden disruptions, and to also adapt to any long-term changes. My fourth point is about diversification of supplies. Again, Alyssa has already touched on this, but so to make my point a bit more briefly, given Alyssa and I had similar thoughts on this, is that Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN as a whole should absolutely avoid over-reliance on one particular country or region for agricultural and for food imports. I think that it's clear to say that we saw the importance and the concerns surrounding this in around February and then in March, also 2022 in the immediate aftermath of the Ukraine-Russia war, when the war impacted the food supply and food supply systems, as well as supply chain disruptions. And it left a number of Southeast Asian countries at the time full of concern about having to scramble for alternatives to Russian or Ukrainian corn, wheat, and soybeans. At the time, there was concern from not only policymakers as well as from governments about that Southeast Asian countries could face significant competition with both East Asian and Middle Eastern buyers for alternative food supplies from different countries, for instance, like Australian or Canadian wheat instead of from Russia or Ukraine. And this, of course, further strained global markets and caused a lot of concern within these countries. So diversifying import partners could definitely play a role in mitigating such risks. I think we could look to, for instance, Singapore, which has signed numerous food import agreements with numerous countries and regions, as one example of how ASEAN could take this as a collective. But then outside of Southeast Asia, we could look also to, for instance, China, which has a food import diversification strategy, and this is including under its Belt and Road Initiative. So to give an idea of how much the quantities and the countries from where China has increased its imports, we could look to last year when China imported around 25% of its food imports from Brazil. The current government in Brazil is a lot more, we could say, China friendly than the previous one. So Brazil was around 25%, and that was followed by the US at around 15% or so. In third place, there was Thailand with around 6% of food imports. Then Australia came in at around 5% of food imports, and various Southeast Asian countries and African and South American countries followed on after that. So the point being that China is also avoiding over-reliance on, say, for instance, the US and countries that it perhaps may have geopolitical or geoeconomic concerns with. And this is something that ASEAN could also work with. And of course, as Alyssa has already touched on, that for any of these strategies to work, there is a need for significant funding. There is a need for governments, policymakers, private sector, and citizens to work together to achieve all of these goals. Thank you, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Genevieve, for this comprehensive perspective. I would like to remind our audience that if you have a question at any time, please feel free to type it below in the Q&A box, and we will address your question after the presentations. So now we are moving on to our third speaker, May, who in her essay argues that ASEAN needs to adopt a holistic, multifaceted approach to food security challenges that reduces external dependencies while building resilience across regional food systems. May, please share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Barbara. Good morning, everyone. As Barbara mentioned, my paper will be discussing how ASEAN can address food security challenges to build a more sustainable food future. So ASEAN faces an increasing food security threats due to geopolitical disruptions and climate change. But this puts immense pressure on existing food systems. And to navigate these challenges, I argue in my paper that a more coordinated and comprehensive approach is needed, and more local production, strengthening regional cooperation, and leveraging technological innovations, ASEAN can reduce external dependencies and build greater resilience. So my discussion will be structured into three parts. Firstly, I provide a very brief overview of ASEAN's ongoing current efforts to enhance food security. Next, I will highlight key vulnerabilities in these efforts. And lastly, present a few key recommendations to strengthen food security moving forward. So firstly, ASEAN has implemented various regional initiatives to enhance food security, and this includes ASEAN's Emergency Rice Reserve under the ASEAN Food Security Reserve and the ASEAN Food Security Information System, which manages rice stockpiles for emergencies and provides critical food security data. ASEAN has also collaborated with partners like the ASEAN +3 Emergency Rice Reserves with South Korea, China, and Japan, and the Global Climate Fund for crop reserves, emergency aid, and advice on food strategies. All in all, this has reduced the percentage of undernourished people in Southeast Asia from around 31% in the 1990s to less than 10% by 2014 to 2016. Despite these ongoing efforts, there is an evident dependency on external actors rather than intra-regional initiatives. So currently, about 89% of the total earmarked stockpile reserves in APTA is committed by South Korea, Japan, and China. So this means that there's a gap of the involvement by the ASEAN countries. And I think that it's crucial for more ASEAN countries to realize the potential of APTA's stockpile reserves and to designate stronger commitments towards maintaining the availability of basic rice reserves during times of unprecedented uncertainty. It's also arguable whether rice alone is sufficient to provide a nutritious diet to ensure proper food security. Therefore, ASEAN should also consider diversifying its reserves by incorporating other nutrient-dense staples and complementary food items to ensure a balanced and resilient food supply. So at the moment, ASEAN's current food production levels are also unsustainable and they remain insufficient to meet its own domestic demands. This makes ASEAN's countries vulnerable to external disruptions, such as shifts in political will and economic downturns. As such, it is crucial for ASEAN to maintain its own capabilities to manage its food security interests. Effective food security policies rely on accurate and timely data. However, information gaps and reporting delays, especially in rural areas with poor infrastructure and lower digital access, can hinder decision-making and resource allocation. Impoverished smallholder farmers often lack the ability to address these concerns. This limits their access to essential support, including financial aid, climate-resilient technologies, and market opportunities. These gaps crucially need to be addressed in order to substantially bolster regional food security and resilience. So in terms of my three main strategies and suggestions that I have outlined in my paper, it bears some similarities, I think, to Alyssa and Genevieve's points. So please bear with me as I go through them. So firstly, I would recommend to strengthen local self-resilient food systems. So it's important for ASEAN to focus on enhancing its productive efficiency and sustainability of its local food productions. And achieving this requires coordinated efforts that will unite smallholder farmers and encourage resource sharing, as well as capacity building initiatives. By expanding across these shared infrastructure and promoting knowledge exchange, farmers can boost productivity, lower costs, and build resilience against external supply chain disruptions. Moreover, investing in sustainable farming practices such as climate-smart technologies is crucial to maintain long-term food security while reducing the vulnerabilities. And equally important is to extend investment beyond production to as well as post-production initiatives. So improvements in education, maintaining storage and distribution facilities can help to minimize loss during transport, retail, and at the consumer level. So these measures not only help to reduce food waste, but also extend the shelf life of produce. And for these strategies to succeed, it is essential, as both Alyssa and Genevieve have mentioned, that governments and private sector businesses collaborate and support local farmers and bridge the rural digital divide, enabling communities to come across and build self-resilience. So while fostering local resilience is crucial, maintaining robust trade and building diverse cooperation partnerships is crucial. This means actively removing both trade and non-trade related barriers to improve intra-regional trade as well as beyond the region. Crucially, expanding beyond current rice partnerships and diversifying varieties stored under EFTA, as well as regular reviews of reserve stock is necessary to ensure that they're during emergencies and enhance replenishment mechanisms and storage and distribution. So such a more coordinated approach will enable more swift responses during crisis. And lastly, is to integrate AI-driven innovations to transform ASEAN's food security frameworks and policy initiatives. So technology is already recognized as a vital part of ASEAN's food security initiatives, but AI has yet to be something that is explicitly integrated and there's no clear regional strategy for its deployment in smart agriculture. So this gap means that AI adoption within ASEAN's agricultural policies remain underdeveloped and somewhat fragmented. Nonetheless, AI offers substantial opportunities that can drive predictive analytics and provide real-time data to optimize farming conditions, thereby strengthening food output. So beyond production, AI can also help to enhance supply chain resilience by offering clearer guidelines for complex legislation, optimizing transport routes, and improving storage management to enhance shelf life of perishable goods to reduce food wastage. Additionally, AI can help to digitalize agricultural finance to enable better analysis of the supply and demand trends, manage price fluctuations for government intervention, and adapting to regulatory changes to improve financing and investments. So while AI holds this promise of addressing structural weaknesses and optimizing food supply chains in the long run, it is more costly and it involves a steep learning curve. So to overcome these challenges, it requires governments to collaborate with private sectors, international organizations, and the local communities to build capacity, share knowledge, and ensure the equitable access to AI technologies. So overall, food security is a very fundamental aspect of national and regional security. It is the building block of everyone's well-being and development of ASEAN's community. Yet, global supply chains disruptions threaten to undermine this. It is crucial for ASEAN to strengthen its own defenses and protect its interests, and by enhancing domestic production capacity and efficiency, enhancing regional trade, and diversifying global partnerships, as well as increasing the quantity and range of reserves, can provide ASEAN with the flexibility to navigate these difficult times. And furthermore, modernizing farming practices and leveraging technology can help ASEAN to build a more resilient and efficient food system. While these are not easy steps, they are necessary and they require the collective effort of the ASEAN community as a whole to develop multifaceted and future-ready strategies to attain long-term food security and sustainable development of the region. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks for those arguments, May. Finally, Louis will round off the presentations. Louis will explain how ASEAN's principle of collective self-resilience provides a promising framework for addressing regional food security challenges, but he will tell us how it requires enhancement to balance national sovereignty with regional cooperation. Louis, please go ahead.
Thank you, Barbara, and it's an honor to be joining you and the other speakers here, saying hi to friends as well who are tuning in. So I think I'll make my presentation in 3 points, following the practice of former Dean Kishore Mabavani at the Kuan School. Firstly, my first point is on non-cooperative behavior. So whenever disruptions happen, and so the question that this webinar is answering is, how can ASEAN ensure food security amidst increasing global supply chain disruptions? So let's assume that the disruptions are external to the region. When these disruptions happen, what we've observed in the previous crisis, in the 2007-08, is that ASEAN has actually had a tendency to make things worse for itself. The global crisis in food prices happened because 2 ASEAN member states, Thailand and Vietnam, joined India in imposing export bans. And the Philippines as well made a big rise in imports. So this non-cooperative behavior leads to price spirals and worsens the crises. But what drives this non-cooperative behavior? The second key point is on the role of the dual mandate of states. States are obligated to meet or provide for the food security needs of their constituents. At the same time, they are expected to be good citizens within the global international trade environment. Now, the problem is, from a longer term perspective, the ability to meet the food security needs of the constituents has been more challenging for Southeast Asia, even before COVID-19 and even before the Ukraine war. You can observe a U-turn in undernourishment in the region. From 2005, when there were 100 million people undernourished, quite big compared to today's 800 million undernourished. So before there were 100 million undernourished in ASEAN, this fell to 60 million by 2014. So close to the Millennium Development Goal of cutting hunger by half. By 2016, this increased to 63.6 million. So this is not a simple statistical aberration. It's actually a part or a representation of a pattern of plateauing, decline in undernourishment, and eventually increasing. And the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine war have only added to this. And this is driven by the vulnerability of Southeast Asia to the impacts of climate change, as shared by the other speakers earlier. The productivity in rice production in the region has fallen to close to half. It used to grow by 2.3% per year. Now it's at around 1% per year. And so, given this, once the disruptions happened, the countries were then forced to meet the needs of their own constituents by imposing export bans. And of course, we know that during COVID-19, rice was restricted or banned by Myanmar, by Cambodia, and by Vietnam, most importantly. Eggs exports were banned by Thailand. And during the Ukraine war, Indonesia banned oil palm exports, and Malaysia banned chicken exports. So, given these dynamics, how do we address this challenge of ASEAN imposing self-inflicting harm through trade disruptions? And I argue, so my third point is on collective self-reliance. Nowadays, when we think of ASEAN strategies, And they are all relevant, such as discussed by the other speakers, APTER, AFSIS, or Food Security Information Systems, and also ATIGA, ASEAN Trade and Goods Agreement, which promotes interregional trade. These are all relevant for building regional resilience. But the challenge with ATIGA is if one or more individual states are finding it challenging to meet their own domestic constituents' requirements, then it's impossible almost to ask them, please don't ban your exports. So this is where the concept of collective reliance comes in. And this was brought up earlier in the 1979 ASEAN Food Reserve Board Agreement, which is the precursor to APTER. So it envisioned two things: collective solidarity, and at the same time, collective subsidiarity. Solidarity, in that all countries aim to contribute to meeting the needs of the region, and at the same time, subsidiarity, where each country plays its own part. It's something similar to the saying, good fences make good neighbors. There are houses being well kept. So this, I think, is a principle that can be explored moving forward. And an example for this, for instance, is if you look at food production patterns in ASEAN and the technology adoption patterns. Why are the technology adoption patterns lower, right? Why is, for instance, among rice producers, why is ASEAN only producing half of its full potential yields in rice? And the reason is demand. When demand is not, the demand for rice is not there, then innovations are not adopted by farmers. And so one of my recommendations is go beyond the ASEAN reserves. ASEAN food reserves focus on a stock that you can draw from. But what replenishes the stock is the production. And so to motivate increasing production and productivity growth, we need to have stable procurement growth that meets ASEAN's demand needs. And this can border on non-market mechanisms because the goal is non-market as well. Addressing food insecurity, especially for those that cannot afford to pay for it, requires some government interventions too. Okay, that's my point. Thank you.
Thanks, Louis. You have highlighted indeed an important point about a dual mandate that ASEAN member states face, which creates tension, particularly during crises. So we have heard four insightful presentations that have emphasized the urgency of ASEAN's food security challenges. And to kind of find a common thread in your presentations, they converge on several strategic approaches, including strengthening intra-ASEAN trade, expanding and diversifying food reserves, regional cooperation mechanisms, technological innovation, and protection of environmental commons. At the same time, this is called counterpoint Southeast Asia. So in terms of counterpoints, you have all prioritized different specific actions or focus areas. So for example, Elisa emphasized environmental commons protection. Then Genevieve stressed diversified import networks, May focused on AI integration and smallholder farmer support, and we highlighted the rice procurement coordination, and all this shows the multifaceted nature of food security in Southeast Asia. And so thank you all very much. And we already have 6 questions lined up. So I will read them in the order they arrived. And then if they are not to a specific speaker or panelist, any of you, if you feel that you want to answer the question, please proceed. So the first question we have is, how can ASEAN nations balance economic growth with food security to ensure that agricultural policies remain sustainable? So any of you would like to answer this first question? Yes?
Well, maybe I'll make a start.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So, yes, it is a challenge. I mean, amid structural transformation, and this is what we discuss in the politics of development class, which I teach. Agriculture is actually a relatively inferior sector compared to other sectors where the rates of return on investment are much higher. And partly this is because agriculture is very much under financially leveraged. So there's less capital use in agriculture, and so productivity growth is also less. So, but the question is, how can ASEAN nations balance economic growth with food security? Well, if you look at Arthur Lewis, and so the father of development economics, his viewpoint was that the rate of growth, the rate of movement of resources away from agriculture should not come at the expense of declining food production, food productivity, and food production growth. So I think that will be the balance that we have to make. So for instance, right now, are we doing a good job at this? When we see that the productivity growth, so given limited land, productivity growth is slower than population growth in Southeast Asia. So then that makes us question whether more can be done to support the farming sector. And if you look at other countries where structural transformation has already happened, meaning they've industrialized, and now we're looking at the European Union, right? So they have seen the need to develop a common agricultural policy because agriculture is an inferior sector. So this CAP provides support to farmers so that they will be incentivized to meet certain levels of production. And I'm not saying ASEAN should definitely use this, but to use it with some caution because it can also lead to altering the incentives for production, which could go against some of the WTO rules as well. Elisa? Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I wanted to look up some stats. As Louis had mentioned, it's true, the Southeast Asia's, each country in Southeast Asia, their agricultural contribution to the GDP is between 10, well, in the case of Singapore, even less than 10, but 10 to 20% of the GDP. And it's a sector that is somewhat considered small and also it counter to the industrialization aspirations of most countries. However, if you look at the numbers, we have 100 million smallholder farmers. There's only about 600 million people who live in Southeast Asia. It means at least 1 in 6 is involved in agriculture, which means that when you're uplifting this sector, you are already uplifting, number one, 1 in 6 people. And those are usually the ones with the lowest socioeconomic standards within the community. So it doesn't go against economic growth, especially when you consider we want to balance economic growth. It actually promotes it. And also it is key to achieving the reduction of the gap between the wealthy and the less wealthy. And the last point I wanted to make is that typically in the past, anytime countries in this region have been contributing to the agricultural sector, often it is coupled with political aspirations, political political needs. So hopefully they'll vote for me, that kind of thing, rather than to increase production. And we need to start looking at, as Lou said, at the agricultural sector as more than just securing votes and keeping the people happy, but really as an integral part of our economy and our stability and our food security. We need to really improve this sector to achieve those aims.
Thank you, Louis and Elisa. Genevieve and May, would you like to chime in on this question?
I think that in this case, Elisa and Louis have already answered the question quite well. They've taken any points that I had thought of while sitting here. I think hopefully great minds think alike.
Okay. Thank you. So I think now we can kind of combine question number 2 and number 3. So the question number 2 reads, how can ASEAN governments attract investment in high-tech farming and urban agriculture solutions to enhance food security? And question number 3 is kind of related. So what are some of the current AI strategies employed by ASEAN or the ASEAN countries, and how can ASEAN expand AI cooperation? So do you have any examples from ASEAN countries that have implemented AI strategies? And maybe, I think Elisa mentioned precision farming. I don't know whether that is related, but if you have any examples or suggestions, yeah, please feel free to answer.
Alyssa, would you like to go first, or?
I was going to say, I think Genevieve brought up that point on precision farming more than I did.
Okay. Genevieve, please.
Well, thank you. I was thinking over our essays as well, and how we've all brought up different points related to AI and different high-tech solutions. I think in answer to the first question about how ASEAN governments can attract investment into high-tech farming and urban agriculture solutions, I think one way would be making it clear that, at least to say development partners and external partners, whether that's regional countries and so on, or to the private sector, is that ASEAN as a whole and also the individual member states are very interested in foreign direct investment into agriculture would be a first step. A second step could perhaps be looking at different kind of pilot programs for key staples across different countries and tailored to local contexts, with whether that's with the private sector, whether that's with up and coming agribusinesses as well, and all kinds of agricultural technology that's out there. There's all kinds of I was going to say festivals, that's not the right word. All kinds of conferences and ways of meeting of policymakers and those interested in food security to be able to meet with young entrepreneurs and those who have all kinds of high-tech equipment and who are also looking for investment. So it might be another way of being able to bring all of these people together so that they can pair up, a bit like a matchmaking service, if that makes sense. I know that Taiwan has something similar for farmers and for the agricultural technologies and the entrepreneurs, so that they're able to match up farmers who have a specific need for something to do with their crops or for harvesting, for production and so on, and with the young entrepreneurs who have the not only the initiative but also the skills and the willingness to be able to build such technology to be able to address the farmers' concerns. So I'll leave it there in case anyone else from the panel would like to add their comments.
Thanks, Genevieve. Maybe May, you have mentioned that it's a steep learning curve with AI. So would you like to add anything to this?
Thank you. I wanted to add on to Genevieve's point, because I think it's kind of like a chicken and egg kind of situation. You need results to attract investment, and you also need investment to get results. So I think the best way for ASEAN to attract investments would, firstly, of course, to have a very clear agenda in terms of transparency, working with partners who have the capability to do so. And I think at present, most AI-driven food security efforts maintain relatively at a domestic level. I know Thailand very recently launched the HandySense Bee Farm, which is an AI-powered smart farming platform. And it offers like real-time data-driven advice on weather conditions and farming techniques. And I think it's very similar to some of the other AI technologies being used across Southeast Asia. You know, we have Vietnam's AI plant doctor and Malaysia's Plantix that helps to detect pests and diseases to help farmers protect their crops. And I think what's happening right now is there's a lot of small level innovations that's being carried out. So what I would hope to see at least is greater cooperation across borders, so we can share best practices, share technologies, and sort of help each other to build collective regional food security interests. And at the regional level, ASEAN has partnered with external partners like China. So very recently we have, I think, ASEAN-China Year of Agricultural Development. So there's food security cooperation initiatives that use AI and new technologies to sort of bridge gaps, encourage technology transfers, people-to-people exchange, and like high-level experience sharing. So I think those are really good steps to sort of build AI partnerships, and it's important to expand our cooperation not just with China but also with other of our regional partners. We can also expand cooperation with area and as well as Google. So I believe we have currently several ongoing AI related projects with these partners, but none of it is specifically targeted to agriculture. So I think that expansion in this area would help to boost at least the capacity and capability of the ASEAN countries to get to that stage where it needs to get to. But of course, all these are external efforts. Definitely from ASEAN's perspectives, it has to start from within and really have a regional strategy, I would say, that's more targeted before you collaborate with external partners to get that cohesive framework rather than have fragmented and little efforts ongoing.
Thank you, May. Louis and Elisa, do you have anything to add to this, or should we move to the next question?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Elisa.
Louis, go ahead. You wanted to say something. I'll share after you.
Okay, thanks. Yes, so in 2021, we did this study, in fact, to assess the state of adoption of digital technologies in Southeast Asia. And although the earlier part of our study was used, it fed eventually to the guidelines on increasing the adoption of utilization of digital technologies in agriculture. So what did our baseline study find? So we did find that the adoption of digital technologies was still nascent in the region. And most of the types of those that are adopted are the low capital investment type. So in particular, digital crop advisory services for farmers. So giving farmers advice, planting schedules, etc. But beyond this, what we find has shown some promise are actually the digital traceability solutions. And why this makes sense for drawing investment in the region is because digital traceability ensures the quality of the products of the farmers, right? And when digital traceability is in place, then you can have off-takers like Nestle or Givaudan to provide more smarter advice to their farmers on, because normally they have these off-taking agreements where they give the farmers the money for the inputs, and then the farmers execute, and then they buy them back later on. So by adopting traceability principles, it allows them to guarantee that the farmers are having good quality, and it's a starting point for providing more financing to the farmers. It's a form of something like contract farming, which I think is also needed. But the overall message is farming as a sector should really move towards enterprise farming, like more market-oriented behavior rather than just subsistence. Yeah, Elisa?
Those were all excellent points shared by everybody. I wanted to just add on to those points. There are actually quite a number of agri-entrepreneurs, as Louis was just mentioning, in this region. It's quite active, in fact, and we've been lucky that this region has received some investment, not as much, of course, as the US or Europe, but it's still quite substantial, and it has created quite a good range of agricultural products in this region. However, there are quite a lot of barriers still in their way. Number one, they lack access to data. I'm not talking about AI data, but just data about populations, data about production, markets, etc. That typically governments do collect this data, but do not want to share. And if this data could be shared, actually, it would help some of these startups and entrepreneurs do much better. Secondly, is to reduce the barriers of entry for new farmers into the space. We all know that this region has aging farmers problem. It's a problem all over the world. And if we want to go into urban agriculture and some of these new investments in agriculture, it does require a younger set of people who are more savvy in these spaces. But the barriers to entry are huge, and typically a new farmer may not be able to do this without getting some kind of access to credit or access to some grants or even reduction of tax, because sometimes these are seen as a manufacturing or whatever, and given the same tax level as others. So governments can actually promote many of these and facilitate more of people coming into the sector by doing so. And in another area that governments could actually improve without having to do high tech, it's actually just improving the value chains, cold chain network that are available to the people to use so that there's less spoilage and more food in the system.
Thank you all for your points. So the next question is for Genevieve. Can you share more about how China's Belt and Road Initiative can affect food security for ASEAN?
Yes, certainly. So I think that it's quite an interesting question. So I'll start off with giving just a bit more information about China's interest in the Belt and Road when it comes to agricultural investment and so on, and then get into the statistics and then look at the positives and negatives so that everyone has a broader picture, and then we can hone in on the details before passing it over to any of my other panelists. So China is interested in importing more food and agricultural goods and agricultural inputs, sorry. So that would be like pesticides, herbicides, fertilizer, and so on from, I guess, what you might call, or what we could call China-friendly countries, including Belt and Road Initiative countries. So this is why we're seeing, I guess, the complexity of the geopolitics, particularly between the US and China play out, and we're seeing tariffs and US protectionism and so on and so on. And so when it comes to Beijing's interest in protecting its food supply, particularly for key agricultural imports, so that would be something like soybeans in particular. So I use soybeans as an example because it was considered a weak link by policymakers in Beijing and in Washington during the first Trump administration, when we saw the tariffs put on American agricultural farm products back in around July 2018. And so since then, China has been investing in the Belt and Road countries, in particular through overseas agricultural investments, particularly in farmland, coordinating policies with other countries, and also seeking to have greater control over the supply chains from the beginning to the end. When it comes to ASEAN China, the statistics are quite interesting. So between 2000 and 2022, the volume of Chinese agricultural exports to ASEAN countries skyrocketed. So it was around US 1.52 billion, and then it jumped up to US 61 billion. So that has since made China into ASEAN's largest source of food and agricultural imports. And at the same time, Southeast Asian nations are among the leading exporters of agricultural products such as palm oil, cereals, sugar, and rice to China. So it's actually going two ways when we look at two-way agricultural trade. It's not just Chinese agricultural goods and food that are being imported into ASEAN, but also the other way around. And so in 2022, ASEAN's agricultural exports to China totaled nearly US 37 billion, and that accounted for around 15.7% of China's total agricultural imports for that year. So based with that information in mind, in terms of to answer the question what it could look like, I think we could say that there are both positives and negatives, and perhaps the fellow panelists will have other points that they would like to make too, but broadly speaking, that stronger trade ties with China, including through the BRI, could happen with various Southeast Asian countries and with ASEAN as a whole. May already touched on about ASEAN-China food cooperation year in 2023. And so we could see a similar situation play out with what we're seeing with various Latin American countries, particularly with Brazil and Argentina, where China has become their biggest, not only biggest trading partner, but is also increasingly interested in looking to Latin America as a whole. And as Alyssa already mentioned, local agricultural production plays a key role in Southeast Asia, so it accounts for more than 20% of the GDP in countries like Laos, going right up to 40% of employment in Myanmar and elsewhere. So in theory, at least, stronger trade with China, with it an enormous population, could mean a stronger role in local agricultural production, and also in terms of supporting, or sorry, accounting for a much greater part of the GDP. There are some estimates out there. I was double checking the trade statistic because I thought that it seems about right, but it also seems to be quite large. But that bilateral trade volume between, including agricultural trade between ASEAN and China, is expected to reach around US 100 billion by 2030. So that's not that far off. In terms of the negatives, what we could also see that concerns about China's growing influence and presence in Southeast Asia, including through the Belt and Road and other initiatives like the Global Security Initiative and so on, could perhaps be a concern for policymakers and for governments and for locals and residents who live across Southeast Asia. I know that it's already a concern for the governments of ASEAN's regional partners, particularly Australia, and also to a lesser concern of New Zealand as well. I think that there could also be a concern about the sense that perhaps China is, quote unquote, I guess, gobbling up all of the food, or taking a lot of the food for export that it produces, or that Chinese companies produce in Southeast Asia, and then exporting it all to China. So locals may feel perhaps that they are being pushed out. Again, there are examples of this happening within Australia, where many local Australian companies and media have been quite concerned about Chinese presence when it comes to overseas farmland in Australia, farmland acquisition, in particular the acquisition of arable land and water resources as well. And there are concerns that Chinese-owned farms, they do not produce food that would be eaten by locals or exported to other states. So say if something is produced in Western Australia, it could be exported to the state of Victoria, New South Wales, and so on. But that it's solely being used for export purposes going back to China. And locals at times in Australia feel that they are not only unable to consume any of food, but they're also unable to reap any of the rewards that come with Chinese foreign direct investment into Australia. So perhaps these are considerations that would be felt across the region. I'll leave it there in case anyone else wants to add anything.
Thank you, Genevieve. Yes, Alyssa, please, you can add.
Just a small point about the trade. China's trade with Southeast Asia is actually a very important part of our resilience strategy. Actually, it's not a strategy, it just happens to be that way. And one case in point is during the early days of COVID, when all the borders started to close. Most of Singapore's food actually then came from China, when everybody was still scrambling around trying to figure out, whether we could bring trucks through, whether ships could move, that sort of thing. We in Singapore were very, very lucky that China's ports remained open, and we got a lot of our food from there. And I know that was the case for many other countries as well. And no, not many, just some other countries. And when one port closed in South, I think was the South closed first, or the North, one of the two closed, it could actually switch to the other port to get food. So our food was continuously flowing, but we didn't realize that it was another port that it came from. And I think going forward, our resilience strategy does have to consider China as well, because number one, they have such an advanced agricultural system. Their policy is so pro-agriculture that they've been doing so much to improve their own agriculture. And if we want to be resilient as a region, we can't get away from actually also including China in our strategy.
Thank you, Alyssa and Genevieve. So we have a few questions or comments related to food production. So maybe let me combine that. And some of you have already mentioned non-tariff barriers and public-private partnerships and harmonization. So the question reads, what are some of the first steps that the ASEAN governments need to take to start collaboration in food production? And then there are some related comments saying that public-private cooperation is necessary, and that also food production in ASEAN must be based on a principle of comparative advantage, and that ASEAN should set up a regional agriculture technical center and introduce appropriate technology to member countries to improve agriculture quality. So what would you say are the first steps ASEAN countries need to take to improve collaboration in food production? Anyone?
Okay, I can start.
Yeah, Louis, please go ahead.
Yeah, there's collaboration from within and from without. So on the collaboration from within, I feel that the private sector needs to really be enticed to invest in agriculture, linking to the earlier question, to the earlier points. So I think that's the first area where ASEAN can start, encouraging the development of good business environments for agriculture. Maybe we can have some benchmarking of these environments. And yeah, so internationally, I think that this, going back to the China question, I think we should look after what our own interests are and not be affected by the larger geopolitics. So, for instance, Malaysia has this, was exploring this thing in China before on digital agriculture, partly because when China purchased Swiss company Syngenta, an agricultural or agri-tech or an inputs provider and tech provider, it was able to roll this out across its countries, right? Its regions or provinces within China. And this is something which, as a South, I mean, in the global North-South divide, it's a relatively South country, right? To be able to apply these technologies even within lower income settings, right? And you see farmers adopting these technologies. I feel like this could be a model for Southeast Asia as well. And one good example of this is China's Pinduoduo company, which is leveraging digital technologies to engage farmers. Apart from helping them sell their produce, they also have this Dodo University for helping farmers to engage in e-commerce. Right? So there's this big ecosystem that needs to be developed across the region and within each country. And that is something that, the region should probably start looking into more. Yeah, over back to you. Nate.
Thank you, Louis. Okay, great. Is there anyone else who would like to add to this question of collaboration in food production? May, yes?
So I think we've talked quite a bit on, improving cooperation, trying to get food production going in terms of like having climate resilient technologies and all that. One thing that I want to talk about a bit more maybe is about the non-tariff trade barriers that you mentioned earlier. So one of the key things that I think needs to be worked on is the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. What that is basically that different ASEAN countries have different levels of guidelines and procedures in terms of food sanitary practices, trying to how they should be stored, how they should be managed. And I think that has become limitations of food being traded across borders because we have different guidelines and different strategies. And because of that, we are hindering a lot of what could be the potential increase of food security. So I think things like this is something that we need to work on and collaborate. So from within, we have a lot of ongoing free trade agreements, a lot of food guidelines, and I think the harmonization part needs to be worked on a lot more. So I think that's something that needs to be worked on as well.
Thanks, May. So before I move on to the next question, Elisa or Genevieve, do you have anything to add to this one?
Just one small point. I recently read news that I think it was yesterday that Thailand and Singapore have signed an agreement. I think it's in relation to companies as well. And one of it was Shopee. I think Shopee, if I'm not wrong, is a Singapore company. Correct me if I'm wrong. And they now have agreed that in Thailand, Shopee will have a separate platform specifically for Thai goods only. So under the Shopee platform, there will be another one to highlight Thai goods. And I think that's something very, very simple that every country should be able in Southeast Asia can do, which is to highlight one platform just for Southeast Asia agriculture so that it can promote local agricultural value-added products within the country so that it can receive a little bit more of the market share. It doesn't have to, I mean, the fact that there's a Toto University in China, that's amazing, but we're a long way from that, I think, in terms of investment as well as reach. But just small steps like that can actually make a difference in improving demand and livelihoods of the people who create them, produce them.
That's an excellent point. Thank you. Genevieve, would you like to add anything, or shall we move to maybe the last question?
I think all of the others have already said the points that I had in mind, so let's move to the next question.
Thank you. So the next question is, let's take this one. In the face of the Trump administration tariffs and trade wars with China, Mexico, and Canada, would ASEAN face a direct impact on its food security? And if so, how? So this is interesting because I also recently read a commentary, I think it was published last month, suggesting that US tariffs might actually inadvertently encourage greater self-sufficiency in Asia. So to what extent do you see it as an opportunity or as a threat to ASEAN security? Yeah, so I don't have an order for this. So if you would like, anyone who would like to start, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So to me, I don't think it's, I mean, yes, global trade, the likely effect of this will be some reorganizing towards lower source countries. So maybe some ASEAN countries, I mean, apart from agriculture, some ASEAN countries can step up to bridge what China was providing. So maybe Vietnam, for instance. And so for other commodities, I can see more of these impacts. For agriculture, it would really depend on how much ASEAN is sourcing from these countries, right? It could also be positive for ASEAN. I mean, when in case some of the commodities of China that are being where restrictions are imposed, so if these cannot go to the US, then more for us. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody has a counterpoint to offer?
This isn't so much as a counterpoint, but to follow on with from what Louis said about how we may see redirection of global and regional trade flows, which is something that ASEAN could perhaps seek to capitalize on, and so particularly for certain commodities.
Thanks,
Okay.
Genevieve. Yeah, actually, yeah. Actually, when the term counterpoint, at first it sounded to me like the musical term coming from a musical family, whereby different voices come in rather than going against one another, but they form one harmony. Yeah, just a small way. Thanks.
Yes. Yes, that's great. So anybody else wants to add to this, or maybe we take one last question?
I just wanted to add, I think in the short term, there will be some need for reorientation, reorganization, and it will cause inflation within within Southeast Asia. And the reason is because, when trade direction changes, ships have to go one way with one load and come back with another load. And when one is rearranged, the other needs to be rearranged as well. Otherwise, the costs start to spiral. And that's what we're facing now with all the reorientation, that people are scrambling to find, a different arrangement for their ships, etc. And I think in the short term, it will cause quite a bit of pain for Southeast Asia. Depending on the scheduling of how all these tariffs start coming into place. But there's 300 million people in the US and a whole lot more outside of the US. So I think it can be done, and that reorganization can be done, and eventually we'll come to a position where we are in a good position.
Thank you, Elisa. May, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, actually, I agree with what has been already said. There's going to be a lot of unpredictabilities in Trump's administration, especially in the short term. We don't know what will happen. It really depends on what he targets, how he targets it, and how much he targets. But I think what I can meaningfully add on to what has already been said is that one thing for sure is that since the last administration of Donald Trump, we see a lot of ASEAN countries starting to diversify their food sources, and they choose to reduce their dependence, not just on the US, but in countries all in particular, so that they reduce their risk to external shocks. And I think this trend will continue to move, and I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that ASEAN countries are trying to find new trade opportunities, trying to improve our trade routes, and becoming more resilient in the long run. So definitely, I think it's unpredictable in the short run, as they all mentioned, but I think ASEAN will manage and we will survive in the long run well.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you all for these points, and we have 2 questions left that we haven't answered, so I can kind of link them together and we can look at them very quickly. So how do you see food security as part of ASEAN's economic security framework? Is it a major component? And to illustrate it, we could also link it to the question of examples, whether ASEAN can learn from other regions that have successfully navigated food security challenges amidst global disruptions. So you have already mentioned China and EU. So how do you see food security as part of economic security? And do you have any specific examples or as like learning opportunities from others in mind?
Okay. So learning from the EU case, I think. I mean, right now it may be less relevant to us since we are still largely an agricultural region. But the only constant really is change. And as we can see in Vietnam, for instance, the industrialization and structural transformation is already happening. So I think it's worth looking into this, the EU's model for cultural cooperation beyond, to explore modalities beyond our current APTER and AFSIS, and to see how farmer support can somewhat be integrated. Of course, it's not an easy task. The question will always be of who should contribute more. Is it the larger countries or the richer countries, right? Or how should the food produced by them then be priced in the market, or should it follow the market mechanism? But as food shrinks in economic importance, I think the public good problem of meeting the future population needs will be increasingly prominent. And so, in a sense, the EU's history is something that can perhaps be learned from as well, or its experience in that regard, structural transformation in agriculture.
Thanks, Louis. We have 4 minutes left, so anybody would like to add anything to answer this question? Yes, Elisa, please go ahead.
I've noticed that quite a few states within Southeast Asia, or small regional bodies within Southeast Asia, actually doing quite well to improve their food security concerns. Most recently, I just heard from Sarawak as well as Johor, both of these states within Malaysia have developed their own food security strategy, because they recognize that it is not only an important part of their economy, but also an important part of their green development future and social development future. And the number one thing that they did is they put a government agency in charge of food security, and that agency has access to private funding as well, and state finances. So I think if more smaller regions were to take leadership within this, I think it would actually, rather than wait for national governments to move, it would actually improve our food security as well.
Thank you so much. Yes, May, please go ahead.
I want to link it to a recent question that sort of just popped up. I see in the Q&A section about the scope of cooperation with India in navigating food security concerns of ASEAN as well. So from what I understand about India is that the crops and agriculture sector is something that is quite sensitive for India. It often restricts exports of key staples, especially in the global south. But what I noticed recently is India has expressed the political will, at least, to become more of a player within Indo-Pacific and to contribute more into the security of the region. We see increase in cooperation efforts. So I think it is possible and there's potential to develop India's partnership and expand it into Southeast Asia. And I think Southeast Asia, ASEAN as a whole, will welcome India's increased efforts. So we can look forward to that, I hope. Yeah, that's something I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
Yes.
Can I just like a two-finger point on maize one? Yes, this ASEAN India recently did a study also on what are the potential points of collaboration within the ASEAN India Working Group on Agriculture and Forestry. And I think something that India can share with ASEAN better is how it leverages its digital identity systems to prevent leakages in agriculture. So this, and I felt that this is something that was worth sharing. So they have these agricultural stacks or data sets for farms, which are used for distributing aid, etc. And it can also be leveraged to see if the digital technologies can be leveraged to see if like the farmers are actually growing in these areas, and to justify the disbursement of fertilizers. Oh yeah, so just like what's being done within the EU as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, Genevieve, please, if you have any concluding remarks you would like to share with the audience, go ahead.
Yeah, just very briefly to add on to what my panelists have already said, that in terms of ASEAN and India, I think India has a number of interesting policies when it comes to technology in particular. So perhaps one area that of cooperation could be looking at agricultural technologies, biotechnologies, data and the AI and other emerging technologies as well. In terms of the other question, in terms of Alyssa's point earlier, I think that it's really interesting, isn't it, to see what different states or what different provinces across Southeast Asia are doing, and that something may not be happening at a national level, whether in terms of a coherent national policy or plan, say a 5-year plan and so on, but that different states are looking at perhaps the regional situation, global geopolitics, and wanting to address concerns about that and doing something at a more local level. So perhaps at some stage there will be, or there could be a sharing of best practices and seeing how the best practices could be tailored to different local contexts. So looking at different topography, different climate, soils, and so on, and population needs. I'll leave it there.
Okay. With that, first of all, I would like to thank the panel for their time. It is very much appreciated that you join us for this session, even though I know you are all very busy. And I would also like to thank the audience for coming over and being practically engaged with your questions. And with that in mind, I'm now closing the 14th iteration of Counterpoint Southeast Asia. Please keep an eye out for our future iterations of this webinar and policy brief series. I wish everyone a great day ahead. Thank you.